What you are looking at are the new Italian tank destroyers, and as you can see as I flip through these, they're unique looking to say the least. But not only do they look unique, but they actually have some unique characteristics, features, and some things about them that I think are going to make them a little bit more on the OP side when it comes to tank destroyers. But anyway, starting with the tier 5, what we're going to do is we're going to go over some general statistics, nothing too deep for now, just generally looking at the tank, looking at its armor, and then of course showing you some of the unique and rather broken characteristics about them. So first, starting with, I don't know how to pronounce the first name, but I'm just going to call it the M41 because that's what it says right there. If we look at the statistics here, it's a tier 5, we can't really expect much, but it has about 580 hit points. I guess that's okay. Main armor is about 110 on the front, 47 on the sides, and 32 on the rear. So it's not very thick, and you can even see here when I go up against another one with another M41 with the M41, you can see it's very flat. There's not a whole lot going on. Even that little bar that you would think be able to bounce, you can actually load heat and just get right through some of those little rectangles there depending on your angle. And its side armor is not great for side scraping. Theoretically, you could get a bounce, but when you've got a flat face like that, it's not recommended. I would say with this tank, given its armor and some of the other characteristics I'm going to go over, definitely a backline tank. It's definitely not an aggressive tank. Probably something that you want to play more like a Stug, maybe even a little bit more reserved than that because your armor just is not fantastic on the tier 5. But anyway, moving on into these other statistics, it's got 1,433 damage per minute, which is not too bad. I would say that's very nice for a tier 5 like this, and is definitely usable. Now, when it comes to penetration, these values are actually a little bit interesting. First of all, the AP rounds have 145 millimeters penetration, which is, I would say, decent. But the heat rounds on this tank is 202 millimeters, which is definitely going to help you out when it comes to penetrating tier 6s, for example, probably even tier 6 heavies, depending on where you aim. So really, this tank is going to be better, mostly because of its penetration, I have a feeling. High explosive, of course, is not very much. It's only sitting at 38 millimeters. Damage-wise, though, it's a pretty typical tank, or a pretty typical gun for tier 6, I would say. 160 damage for AP rounds, 135 for heat, and an okay 200 for HE. These are the numbers that I think are on the T1 Heavy, so if you've ever played the T1 Heavy, it's basically the same numbers as that. Not overly amazing, but not bad necessarily. And as well, the last thing here is that its speed's actually pretty nice. It's got 44 kilometers per hour. And one thing I forgot to mention, it does have 7 degrees of gun depression, so you can use it to work a few positions. But again, with your flat face, it's just going to be really easy to get through that. But anyway, moving on from the tier 5, let's go to the tier 6, which is, if I can pronounce this right, probably something like Basalto or something like that. Basically, it's like a tier 6 version of the tier 5. Not much has changed other than, of course, the gun itself. But again, as you can see here, very flat face, flat lower plate. You've got that little red bar that goes across in between your gun and your tracks, and it's red, but the likelihood of someone bouncing off that consistently is not very high. Again, the sides are not very thick. Side scraping does not work very well in this. And, of course, with your flat face, it's basically impossible to side scrape. The back of it can be HE'd. Same thing with the previous tank, the M41. So the back of pretty much all these tanks can be HE'd fairly easily, so that is something to keep in mind. Mobility-wise, this tank is a little bit slower, not much. It's still 42 kilometers per hour, so it's definitely a nice tank for getting around the map, but definitely, again, not a frontline tank. Now, when it comes to the hit points, it's much better. It's at 950 base, so about 1,000 hit points or so. So you definitely have a little bit more buffer when it comes to hit points than you did with the M41. In terms of the damage per minute, it is significantly better. It is 1,895, which is definitely going to make getting a lot more damage a little bit easier. 2,000-ish damage per minute, probably, if you were to get things like provisions and stuff like that, adrenaline and such. You could probably get this to somewhere around 2,000, maybe a little bit over damage per minute. So that is nice. It is definitely a more damage per minute tank. Reload time is 9.5 seconds, so roughly 10 seconds. And what you get there is, for the penetration on your AP rounds, is 172. So already that's a little bit of an increase over the previous tank. And the heat rounds are 239 millimeters. So really, you should be able to penetrate just about any tier 6 heavy tank relatively easily, with maybe the exception of like a VK or something that has a little bit of troll armor. But for the most part, you should be able to get through them, especially the front of an ARL. I have a feeling you could probably get through there pretty easily at certain angles. High explosive, you got 50 millimeters of penetration this time, which is about 12 better than the previous tank. So you're going to be able to penetrate more with your HE, but it's still not like super incredible when it comes to that penetration. However, the damage on these shots is significantly better. The AP rounds are 300 damage per shot, which is a lot better and is a fairly sizable chunk. For example, if I was shooting another one of these tanks, that would take out roughly a third of their hit points. So this is no small amount of damage that you're cleaning off the enemy. So 300 for AP rounds, pretty good. 260 for heat rounds, again, pretty good. It's not as good as the 300, but considering you have more penetration there, using heat is not a bad idea in some situations. High explosive is honestly kind of mediocre compared to the other two. It's sitting at 350. It's not bad. It's definitely better than AP rounds, but probably not going to be a whole lot of situations where you're just going to want to switch to HE, particularly in higher tier matches. And one other thing to note about the Basalto is that its engine is really bad. It's very, very weak when it comes to getting damaged. You can see here, I was with Candy Crusher and we were shooting each other in the exact same spot, and I broke his engine twice, and that was just with 2 shells. So each time I shot him in that spot, it broke his engine. When he shot me there, it broke the engine. That was 3 engines that broke over the course of a few seconds. So needless to say, the engine on this is pretty weak. Now moving on to the next tank is the tier 7, and this is the SMV CC 56. Now, there are 2 guns on this tank, and we're already starting to get into the weird-looking category. I'm going to pause on the guns real quick. So, if you look at the tank itself, it's very awkward, and honestly, playing it, it's basically a tier, it's basically like a heavy and a tank destroyer mixed. It's got pretty decent armor for the most part. You can actually penetrate quite a few areas if you do run into a player not using this correctly, because as you can see, the lower plate is pretty weak. It's not very good at all. And of course, you can actually penetrate, I believe even with AP rounds, the little angled areas in the front there, you can see there. So yeah, you can penetrate there, and as well you can penetrate the hatches. Now, honestly, playing it, I would almost just classify it as a heavy. The only reason that I think it would not be is because the turret actually has limited traverse, so it's not a free spinning turret. It actually has a limit of 45 degrees left and 45 degrees right. So that's the characteristics when it comes to the armor. Now I want to talk about the guns, because there's something interesting here. There are 2 top guns that you can choose from. One of them is just a normal gun, so you shoot, you reload, you shoot, just like the previous 2 tanks in the line. And that's going to give you about 2,000 damage per minute. It's a little bit over that, but it's sitting about 2,000, which is nice. It's not extreme, but it's definitely usable. But the thing is, if you go with the other gun, you actually have 3 shells. But this is a 3-shell auto reloader, which basically means you reload each shell individually. But unlike most auto reloaders, you're really not going to want to shoot all 3 shells that you have here, because the first shell takes 23.01 seconds to reload. That's basically a KV2 reload for your first shell. So yeah, you're definitely not going to want to shoot that very often, because that's going to make you really vulnerable during that time when people are able to push on you. If they see that you shot all 3 shells, good luck, because you're just going to get absolutely rushed because people are going to know that you're on a 23-second reload. However, if you let that 23-second reload happen in the beginning of the game and then you're good to go, you can actually reload the next shell in a small 5.75 seconds and then the third shell in 4.79. So ideally, if you can do this, you really only want to shoot the third shell and then let it reload constantly. Use it kind of like a one shell gun, except for some interesting scenarios where if you really want to just get a quick burst of damage, you can shoot two. And if you're really, and I mean really, in a pinch, or it's really good, just going to wipe out an enemy tank, then maybe shoot the third shell. But definitely don't use it as your main. Definitely wait. And you can see here, it's just such a long reload. And it's just not something you want to shoot all the time. But anyway, those are the reloading parts. Now let's actually talk about the other parts of the gun. So the average penetration for AP rounds is 208. Not as impressive as some of the other tanks, given that this is the higher tier. It's still doable, and it will definitely penetrate a lot of tier 6 heavies, tier 7 heavies too, but it's not as good. Now, the high explosive or anti-tank, i.e. heat rounds, do give you 252, which is definitely going to pen most tanks somewhere in the front, but still, it's just not the highest number in the world. High explosive has 60 millimeters of penetration, and you are going to be able to HE certain things. And again, on this tank, you can actually HE it in the back, so that's something to keep in mind. If someone circles around you, you can't turn your turret all the way. It's going to be really annoying if a light tank gets around and has HE that they can shoot into you. It's going to be a little bit difficult to kind of get them off your tail. Now, when it comes to the damage of the gun here, we've got 240 for AP rounds, 200 for heat rounds, and 270 for high explosive. So these actually are not as good as the previous tank. The previous tank had 300, 260, and 350. And all of these numbers are actually lower. So it's not terribly great. But at least the damage per minute is better, so, faster reloads and stuff, so that is nice. Hit points, 1,200, that's not a whole lot more than the previous tank, and your mobility is 36 forward, so it's going to be noticeably slower than the others. As well, I didn't mention the previous tanks, but they actually had fairly decent turn rates from what I felt. But this one is definitely a bit slower because the whole turn rate is 28.32, whereas the previous ones, if I look, were, nearly in the 50s. So this is going to be a little bit slow to turn around. So it's not a mobile tank. Personally, with the 7 degrees of gun depression that you have in the armor, best thing that you can probably do is actually, in certain scenarios, actually play this front line maybe midline, so that you don't get as focused when you're on the long reload. So somewhere midline, maybe front line when you're playing this tank. But anyway, that's enough of this tank. Let's move on to the tier 8, which is the SMV CC 64. Now, this tank is probably the ugliest out of the entire bunch. It looks like a hippo. It's just big, tall, wide, and it's basically just a driving box. It's kind of ugly. But at the same time, you do, again, with the previous tank, have good armor, decent-ish gun depression. Actually, no, that's actually really decent gun depression. I need to look at these numbers a little bit more frequently. Gun depression is 11 degrees, so generally speaking, 10 degrees is a good amount of gun depression, but we've got an extra degree. So yes, you're actually going to probably be able to play this a little bit more frontline than even the tier 7, because you are actually going to have more gun depression, and you're going to be able to use those ridges. And again, with the very, very thick armor, it's just not going to be as vulnerable. Now, the nice thing about this tank is that those angled areas that I talked about on the previous tank, they're not as weak on this one. They're much more angled, they're harder to hit. Of course, you've still got the lower plate, but it's thinner. And then, of course, you've also got the hatches, which, let's be honest, you're going to have to be really good to hit these. In testing this, AP rounds would not actually go in. It looked like they would, but every time we shot AP rounds at each other in the hatch, they just didn't go in, and we basically had to go to heat every single time that we wanted to do this. I think maybe it is possible, but definitely go with heat just for a more reliable penetration there. Or maybe just not at all, because it is a very tricky shot to make, especially on the move. And if you're both wiggling around, say you're in a 1v1 situation, it's not going to be the greatest choice in the world. Side armor, just like with all the previous tanks, very thin, easy to penetrate. I mean, this is the case for basically all tanks in the game, with very few exceptions. Back, like I said, can be HE'd, and you can also be HE'd in the back of the turret, which is something that I forgot to mention. So the ammo rack is in the back of the turret, which in our testing, pretty much any time we got all 3 shells into the back of the turret, it would at least damage the ammo rack. So this ammo rack is very, very vulnerable. Now, the back is also very vulnerable, and that's usually where the engine's at, and yeah, it can be pretty prone to burning. So really, just at all costs, be making sure that you're watching around you. So if you see a light tank or a medium tank, or in this case for this tier, a T-49, get the back of your tank hugged up against some rock or something, because it's going to be so hard to keep him off once he starts HEing you in the back. You're going to be too slow to turn around, and it's just going to be a very bad day if you do that. Now, the hold turn rate is, again, very bad. Like the previous tank, it's about 30, so it's slow. And you've also got the turn limit on your turret of 45 degrees. Just at all costs, make sure those lights and mediums don't get behind you, because otherwise it is game over for you. If they're going to track you, it's going to be absolutely obnoxious to try to get them off, and it's just not a fun day at all. Now, it is 2 kilometers per hour faster than the previous tank, sitting at 38, which is still not super fast, but it's doable, and given how much armor you have, it's reasonable. Now, again, like with the previous tank, this one has 2 guns. Now, the first gun is, of course, the single shot. Just all the time single shot, that's all it ever does. 2,759 damage per minute. That's starting to get into the realm of the really good damage per minute. That's definitely a nice amount. And you also have the option for the second gun, which is the auto reloader. Now, when it comes to the 2 guns, you actually have different damage and penetration values for each one. The tier 8, the tier 8, they're all tier 8 guns. The tier 8 gun that's just a single shot actually has 410 alpha. So if you go for the single shot gun, you're going to have a beefier shot, you have to reload and you don't have any backup or burst damage. So you do have higher alpha, so it's 410 for AP, 350 for heat, and then 525 for high explosive, which is pretty good, I must say. That's a pretty big chunk to be able to take out of the enemy. When it comes to the average penetration, it's 225 for AP on this gun, 281 for heat, 60 for high explosive. Pretty nice. Now, the stats are a bit different for the tier 8 gun. So with the, I keep saying the tier 8 gun, the auto reloader gun. I got to get my words correct here. So with the auto reloader gun, your penetration is 229 for AP, 285 for heat, and 60 for high explosive. So they're fairly similar, and there's really not much difference when it comes to the penetration. But the damage per shot is where you see the big change, because unlike with the previous one, this is a lot lower. It's still good, it's just a lot lower. So the AP rounds, your damage is 320, heat 290, high explosive 410. And if we look again at this other gun, 525 to go down to 410, pretty big dip. However, like I said, with the previous tank, this has 3 shells, and it's an auto reloader. The first one starts at roughly 23 seconds, so it's basically just a really long KV2 reload, and then you've got an 8.6 and a 7.6 reload, roughly. So when it comes to burst damage, you're definitely going to want to go this gun. So all in all, I would actually argue that maybe going with the auto reloading gun is still going to be better in certain scenarios, because you're going to be able to get 2 shots out. And if you think about it, if you have the opportunity to only get 1 shot out, 525 is a good number, but then you got to go on a reload, and you might miss a second shot. Whereas with the auto reloader, if you have both shots at once, let's say theoretically you get 2 HEs, that's going to be 820. And as you can probably imagine, 820 is a lot bigger than 525. So all in all, you're probably going to want to run the auto reloading gun. Now I just need to double check here. So it does seem that the damage was different on the tier 7. I'm not going to go back and explain it. If you want, you can see these are the two guns. But anyway, moving back to what's actually next, and that is the tier 9. Personally, just looking at it, playing it, the tier 9 might be the strongest tier for tier. I'm not going to just say right now that it is. I've not played enough in it, but it seems like there might be a little bit more going for this tank. Now, this tank only has the option of an auto reloader, so that we don't have to worry about gun choices, because there's only one choice. You can choose either the bad one or the good one, and chances are you're probably going to want to go for the good one. Now, in this tank, you've got 1,800 hit points, which is a pretty decent amount, I guess. It's getting very near 2,000. And your damage per minute with the gun is going to be sitting at 1,526. And that is if you are shooting all of the shells. If you are not shooting that 23-second long shell, you're doing way better. 12.46 seconds and 10.55 seconds for the 2 shells. If you can, again, just shoot the 2 shells. Or if you really can, just shoot 1 shell at a time and let it keep reloading, because that's going to give you the maximum damage per minute. So when you do finally get these tanks in Update 9.4 and you're looking at the statistics, and you see that the damage per minute is just absolutely abysmal, it's not. They added the numbers in one way, and you really should be playing it a different way. So these numbers can actually get way, way better. Way better. Now, let's go over the penetration, because this is interesting here. The AP rounds have 259, which is a fairly decent amount of penetration, I would argue. And the high explosive anti-tank, or the heat rounds, have 326. So we've broken over 300 millimeters of penetration. That should be plenty to get through just about anything. The high explosive has 85 millimeters of penetration, so that is a little bit better than the previous tank, but we can kind of expect that too. Now, the average damage for this one is 450 damage for the AP rounds. That is a massive chunk. So let's say, for example, you're just shooting 2 shells. That's 900 damage. And then if you're really in a pinch and you just go and you shoot all 3 of your shells, let's see, what is that? That would be, I think that's 1,350 or something like that. That is absolutely insane. That is a very large amount of damage. That's over 1,000, well over 1,000. So yeah, very, very strong there. Your damage for heat rounds is 390, also very good. And your high explosive damage is 640. So the gun is very good, and we're not even done talking about the good stuff here, because it also has 13 degrees of gun depression. So we're getting into the really insane category of lots of gun depression. 13 degrees is plenty to do just about anything in the world. And you can even see here, I can look down so far. Now, when it comes to the armor on this tank, it's pretty good. It's not as good as the tier 8 or the tier 10 tier for tier. It is weaker, but it can still be a little bit troll. It's just not as strong. In general, I would say this one's definitely not one you want to play too frontline, probably mid. In this case, you may even just want to play this backline, which is unfortunate because you do have all that gun depression. But believe me, there's going to be some situation where that 13 degrees is going to come in really handy. So I would say that this tank is a very, very strong one tier for tier. When it comes to the armor, lower plate, pretty typical. And the cheeks on this one are actually fairly easy to penetrate. Below the gun can be penetrated. And I want to say somewhere in the hatches too. So it's not as strong, like I said, when it comes to the armor, but the gun out of all of these is probably the best, which is, of course, really nice. Now, the speed, if I look down here, 35 kilometers per hour. So we're sitting about what we were with the tier 8. Turret turning left and right is the same, 45 degrees, so you aren't able to turn around. You can be HE'd in the back. Just all these different things. You're really going to want to avoid getting flanked. And now, here we come for the last tank here, and this is, if I can pronounce it right, the Minotauro. Now, this is the tier 10, it's only got one gun option, one turret option, it's just, it's the tank. There's all that you, let me just re-say this. Once you get the tank, you have everything. There's no upgrading to do. It's just pretty normal, and you've only got one option when it comes to the gun. Now, when it comes to this gun, you have, again, it says 1,757 damage per minute, which sounds really bad, but again, it's because of that 23-second long reload. I kind of wish they showed the damage per minute without using that shell, but you can just get a kind of a sense that it's going to be better. So we can't really take that into consideration too much. Now, the first shell, like the previous ones, 23 seconds. Pretty long KV2 reload, basically. But the other ones are 10.55 and 9.59. And those are going to be some pretty nice numbers, especially given the alpha and the penetration. Now, the penetration for AP rounds on this tank is 275. For heat, it's 320. And for high explosive, it's 65. So compared to the tier 9 tank, the penetration is kind of iffy, to be honest. The AP penetration is worse than the tier 9, but the high explosive anti-tank shells are slightly better, and the high explosive is the same. But the biggest difference that you see here compared to the tier 9 is the damage per shot. It is just not as good. The at least when it comes to the HE rounds. So the AP rounds are better. They are 490 a shot. That is a lot of damage per shot. High explosive, 410. Again, a lot of damage per shot. High explosive is 630. So really, the tier 9 has better HE damage. So when it comes to HE, that one's going to be the king. However, in this case, it's going to be better when it comes to AP and high explosive damage. Now, this one does not have as much gun depression. It only has 10 degrees, which is unfortunate, but it's kind of reasonable considering the armor that I'm about to show you, because it's red all over the place. I would argue that this tank is probably the most well armored. The only things about it is that there are a ton of microscopic weak spots. Some of them microscopic. You can see there that the axle shaft there in the front can be penetrated, but given its size, it's not going to be the easiest thing in the world. So there is that. Now, the other weak spots would be right below the gun mantlet, and of course in the lower plate in some areas if you load heat, and then of course in your turret. Sides are pretty weak, back can be HE'd. Pretty typical story. Same thing with the previous tanks, just a little bit more armor. Speed's pretty low though, you've only got 34 forward. And of course you can't turn around very quick because you've actually got the worst hull turn rate out of all of the tanks in this branch here at 24.55 degrees a second. So in general, it's got a big gun that hits like a truck, does not turn around very fast, does not have as good gun depression as the tier 9, but has some pretty thick armor, to say the least. So that's all that I have for these tanks, but there is one other thing that's about all of the tanks together that I want to mention, or most of the tanks together, I should say. And that is when they are running their auto reloading guns. Here's a clip. You can see that if you get into the right position, you've got all 3 shells loaded, and you're looking at the back of one of these, you can shoot 1, 2, and then 3, and you've wiped out the enemy almost every time. I believe this works for every tank. I didn't test it with every tank, but looking at the damage and looking at their hit points, I think it's going to be likely that you can do this pretty reliably for all of them. So tier 7, tier 8, tier 9, tier 10, they're going to be able to just one-clip each other if they're using HE. But anyway, those are the Italian tank destroyers. I hope y'all enjoyed, and as always, have fun, good luck, and happy tanking.